My name is Emily Carter, and I thought I knew exactly who I was. 15 years of marriage, a husband I had trusted with every secret of my soul, and a life that seemed ordinary but safe. That was my reality. At least that's what I told myself every morning when I got up, looked in the mirror, and forced a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I always believed that love, once established, was a constant, something unshakable. But that night, our 15th wedding anniversary, everything changed. I had spent weeks preparing for that evening, not because it was just another anniversary, but because I wanted it to be unforgettable. The restaurant I had chosen was perched atop a high rise in downtown Chicago, offering panoramic views of the glittering city below. Twinkling fairy lights were draped across the glass walls, soft jazz hummed in the background, and a string quartet had been arranged to play our favorite songs. The staff had promised perfection, and I had spared no effort in coordinating every last detail. From the floral arrangements to the champagne selection, down to the chocolate truffles on the dessert table. I wanted this night to reflect everything I had always hoped our marriage would be: intimate, loving, and filled with warmth. David, my husband, had been unusually quiet all day. He had barely looked at me during breakfast, and his usual morning jokes had been replaced with tense silences. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was stressed at work, or perhaps he was tired. But as the hours ticked by, I began to notice subtle shifts. His eyes flicking to his phone, the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible sighs he released whenever I attempted to engage him in conversation. Despite my unease, I tried to focus on the evening. I slipped into the dress I had carefully chosen, a deep navy gown that hugged my curves without being revealing, paired with modest pearl earrings, and styled my hair into loose waves. My reflection in the mirror showed a composed, polished woman, but behind that mask, anxiety churned like a storm. I rehearsed my smiles, my toasts, and even the small jokes I had planned to make the evening feel lighthearted. When we arrived at the restaurant, our closest friends were already waiting. They greeted us warmly, complimenting my dress and David's suit. I forced myself to respond cheerfully, masking the creeping tension in my chest. The evening began normally, laughter, small talk, and the clinking of glasses. But a shadow of unease lingered over me, growing heavier with each passing moment. The highlight of the evening was supposed to be the cake. A delicate creation, adorned with white flowers and gold accents. It was brought out amid a chorus of happy anniversary from our friends. I had spent months planning this surprise, intending to deliver a short speech, expressing my gratitude for our years together and my love for David. My heart swelled with anticipation, and for a brief moment, I felt that perhaps everything would be perfect, that the unease I felt all day was just my imagination. Then David stood. He raised his glass, smiling broadly at our friends, and began to speak. "Everyone," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the rooftop, "I have something to share." I smiled nervously, expecting some playful comment or a heartfelt toast, but the words that followed shattered my world. "I just want to say that marrying Emily was the biggest mistake of my life." I froze. The string quartet faltered mid-note. My friends' smiles vanished, replaced with horrified expressions. My stomach dropped to my feet, and for a moment, I felt as though gravity itself had abandoned me. My heart raced uncontrollably, my ears ringing with disbelief. What did you just say?" I managed, my voice barely more than a whisper, trembling as though it were a fragile thread about to snap. David's smile widened, almost amused. "I said it." He replied casually, as though stating a fact about the weather. "I love the idea of a marriage, I love the image of us, but after 15 years I've realized I've wasted my time. I thought I was marrying my dream, but I married someone else entirely, someone who isn't me." The words pierced me like shards of glass. Every single laugh, every tender moment, every quiet night we had shared together suddenly felt like lies. My friends looked at me with uncertainty, some offering awkward glances, others frozen in shock. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to make him regret this cruelty. But my voice had deserted me. I excused myself to the bathroom, my legs trembling so violently that I nearly stumbled. Inside, I locked the door, pressed my forehead against the cold tile, and let the tears flow freely. I couldn't control them. They poured in a torrent of betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation. I thought about the years we had shared, the life we had built, the dreams we had woven together. And now all of it seemed meaningless. As I sat on the bathroom floor, I began replaying every conversation, every argument, every small disagreement. Had there been warning signs I had ignored? Was this his truth, or was it some sudden impulse meant to humiliate me publicly? My mind raced, spinning out of control. I had always been patient, always forgiving, always loyal, and yet this one moment destroyed everything I thought I had accomplished in life. I looked at myself in the mirror. Emily Carter, the woman who had trusted blindly, who had believed in love and stability, stared back at me with tear-streaked cheeks. I didn't recognize her. I didn't recognize myself. But beneath the shock and despair, a small ember of resolve began to glow. I would not allow him to destroy me and walk away unscathed. Not like this, not ever. Returning to the party, I plastered on a smile, smooth and practiced. I greeted our friends as though nothing had happened. I felt the heat of David's eyes on me, his smirk a constant reminder of the humiliation he had inflicted. "Em, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with mock concern. "Of course." I replied, my tone calm, almost chilling in its composure. "I just need some air." I slipped out onto the balcony, letting the cold wind whip through my hair. The city lights blurred through my tears, but I saw them not just as lights. They were symbols of freedom, opportunity, and power. I realized something crucial. I couldn't remain the same person. I couldn't be vulnerable, broken, or weak. I needed to transform. I needed to reclaim control over my life. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake in the bedroom that had once been a sanctuary, now feeling like a cage. My thoughts churned relentlessly. The betrayal, the public humiliation, the years of unnoticed devotion. They fueled a fire within me. I began to form a plan that would restore my dignity, that would make him regret underestimating me. A plan that would change both our lives forever. By morning, the decision was made. I would not let David's words define me. I would not let this be the end of my story. Instead, it would be the beginning of something much larger, something deliberate, calculated, and unavoidable. Revenge was no longer just an idea, it was a promise. On our wedding anniversary, everything changed forever. My husband said something in front of everyone that broke me completely. The next day, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I had rehearsed this ending in my head 1,000 times, the exact tone of my voice, the look in his eyes, the precise way the room would fall silent. But real life never fits perfectly into rehearsed moments. Real life, as I discovered, is messier and far more intimate, and the truth cuts slower when it's delivered from a place of power rather than desperation. When I began, my strategy was simple in outline and devilishly complex in execution. Gather leverage, cultivate allies, sharpen every legal and financial instrument I could wield, and then let David's own arrogance finish the job for me. I promised myself I wouldn't stoop to the petty theatrics of public shaming that would cheapen everything I had rebuilt. I wanted his downfall to be surgical, inevitable, and dignified on my side. He would lose status, money, and control, but he wouldn't get the cruelty of watching me crumble. He would get the much worse thing, the silent realization over months and years, that he had helped engineer his own ruin by underestimating the woman he humiliated. By the time I set the final sequence in motion, I had amassed a small fortune in hidden accounts, investments under shell entities, and stakes in companies that fed directly into David's professional ecosystem. I had a network of lawyers, a discreet private investigator named Marcus, and a communications strategist, Lena, who specialized in crisis management and public narratives. Most importantly, I had the quiet confidence of someone who had seen humiliation, decided it would not define her, and then refashioned every shard of that pain into tools. My first move was always going to be financial disentanglement. We had never had children. Everything about our marriage had been, for David, a transaction, image, status, the discreet comfort of someone who catered to his needs. So the legal battle would be clean on paper but messy in practice. I started by quietly transferring ownership of several assets into trusts in LLC I controlled. Not one transfer was illegal, everything was within the bounds of the letter of the law, but law and leverage danced together and I intended to lead. I remember the day I served him the papers like a precise incision, crisp, neutral envelopes handed to his assistant with a polite request that he review them that afternoon. I let him open them himself. David's face when he read the initial notice and innocuous request to renegotiate ownership terms on several domestic and investment properties was the first small thing that told me he was losing his cool. It was never the papers alone, it was how he reacted. He called me furious, a voice splitting between shame and anger. "Emily, what is this?" he demanded, fingers probably slamming against his desk in some high rise I had helped him climb. "A financial cleanup," I said evenly. "I've separated our household finances. We signed documents for a reason, transparency, protection. I'm simply exercising a right we both agreed to protect our assets." He sputtered about betrayal. He accused me of manipulation. Men like David always reach for rhetoric when they lack facts. It helps them pretend they are moral victims. I let him rail the more he filled the air with his anger, the more I knew I had him where I wanted. Anger led to mistakes. Mistakes led to exposed habits. While he raged, my team quietly opened lines of communication with several of his key investors. I didn't issue threats. I offered truth, clear, documented records of certain questionable expenditures in David's firm, carefully annotated and legally sourced. I asked for conversations under the guise of risk mitigation. People who had a lot to lose listened. Marcus dug deeper than anyone. He found patterns of transfers that were opaque, of contracts awarded to shell companies linked through a chain of intermediaries to vendors that serviced both me and him. None of these findings were direct proof of criminality, but they laid the groundwork for a powerful narrative. David's company had been leaking capital through self-dealing and conflicts of interest. That was the language of corporate boards and investors, and it was lethal. When a board smells mismanagement, they don't immediately ask for forgiveness. They ask for action to protect the business. Lena built a narrative that didn't scream revenge, because raw vindictiveness loses its power outside of a courtroom drama. Instead, she framed everything as a fiduciary concern: transparency, governance, and fiduciary duty. The investors and board members I had cultivated over months, some met through the classes I took. Some, impressed at the dinners where I spoke with unassuming authority, accepted a discreet briefing. They asked questions that David, in his arrogance, answered with confidence and flippancy. Flippancy in the face of questions about funds is a mistake executives never recover from. It happened at a quarterly board meeting. I was not seated at the table I never needed to be, but I had placed allies there. A new investor I had quietly helped acquire a small stake in the company, a compliance officer whose loyalty had shifted when I offered her professional advancement, a partner whose interests had aligned with mine after a careful set of negotiations. When the compliance officer presented the initial audit showing irregularities in vendor payments, the room shifted. David tried to dominate the conversation as he always did, his charm like varnish covering shaky timber. But charm is not a defense in the face of documents. Documents do not get distracted by a smile. He could have handled it one way: humble, cooperative, transparent. Instead, he lashed out. He accused the board of paranoia, of being small-minded. He accused one of the investors of betrayal. He went on the offensive, the classic hallmark of someone with no strategy beyond intimidation. I watched through the window of a nearby cafe as his empire crumbled under the weight of its own rot. I felt no joy in the collapse of an institution I had once believed in, but I felt fierce satisfaction in the justice of proportion. The man who had humiliated me in public was now unmasked by his own choices. The first set of consequences was swift. Regulatory inquiries were opened. An external auditor was retained at the insistence of investors who no longer trusted internal reports. David's board asked him to step down pending review. The press picked up on the story. Tech CEO steps down after financial irregularities was the type of headline that kills careers. My hand had been invisible, my influence intangible, but the results were visible to everyone who mattered. In public, David tried to cling to dignity. He released statements about focusing on due process and protecting shareholder value. But the whispers had started. The rumor mill is a beast that feeds on certainty and spits out suspicion. People who had once toasted his name at gala dinners now kept their distance. Clients who depended on his brand for their own reputations quietly renegotiated contracts. A man who had once moved through rooms with effortless dominance found himself standing alone. Yet the most potent part of my reckoning was not the corporate fallout. That would have been satisfying enough. The true art of revenge is in the personal unraveling, the loss of reputation among peers, the internal erosion of self-worth that no money can immediately replace. For that, I engineered a quieter assault. I knew about certain women he had kept at arm's length, the fleeting fling's name, dropped in the kind of gossip David assumed no one would take seriously. I also knew how David liked to use his status to charm his way out of responsibility. Instead of confronting these relationships publicly, I cultivated connections with those who had something more tangible to lose, influential people, whose alliances could change the currents of his life. There was Kate, an editor at a prominent magazine who had once considered featuring David in a glowing profile. There was Paul, a longtime client whose companies provided lucrative contracts and who hated public scandal more than anything. I didn't blackmail them. That would have been vulgar and left me vulnerable to counterattacks. I simply provided them with facts and let silence do the rest. Kate withdrew the feature, worried that a piece tied to scandal would harm her outlet's credibility. Paul renegotiated his contracts and quietly distanced his businesses. Each person stepping back tightened the net around David. He tried to fight back with legal countersuits. His team launched an aggressive narrative that his sudden ousting was orchestrated by a vengeful spouse intent on destroying him. He painted me as petty, small, vindictive. It would have been convincing if there were no facts. But facts audits, email trails, the slow accumulation of evidence do not pale in the face of rhetoric. They stand clear and immovable. The courtroom process that followed was not the melodramatic spectacle I had imagined in my head growing up on TV dramas. It was sterile, procedural, and blunt. Depositions are a kind of crucible. You are asked the same question in a dozen different ways until your carefully curated story starts to lose its sheen. David's team tried to use the old tactic of painting me as emotional and irrational. I refused to perform grief for them. I was steady, precise, and calm. Every document I produced, every witness I called, had been vetted, cross-referenced, and backed by real data. In law, preparation as armor, I had forged a cuirass. There were moments when his eyes met mine across the room, and flashed with a feral understanding not of the legal predicament, but of personal betrayal. He realized that his public humiliation had been met not with a collapse, but with a construction. Rather than punishing him in the wild, vulgar way he had punished me, I had built a life he no longer had access to. That realization ate at him. The legal settlement, when it came, was clinical. Assets were divided, accounts restructured under terms that protected my financial independence. He was barred from certain leadership positions for a time pending regulatory clearances. He faced penalties and was forced to sell significant holdings to cover fines and buyouts. I could have asked for punitive sums, ruinous alimony, or public statements that would have guaranteed his disgrace. Instead, I requested and received structure, independence for myself, reform for his company, and a legal separation that would protect me from future entanglement. It was a functional kind of victory, not theatrical, but enduring. And then the final, quietest part of the reckoning, I took my revenge in a way David never anticipated. I walked away. After months of litigation, whisper campaigns, and the slow erosion of his empire, I realized how easily revenge can become a trap. The goal had always been not to become cruel, but to reclaim my life. To let David rot in the consequences of his choices while I lived freely, fully, and without the weight of that marriage. So on the final day, when the settlement documents dusted the table and the signatures were dry, I packed a single suitcase and moved out of the house we had once shared. I left him the big things that had never really belonged to either of us, the trophy items, the ostentatious furniture meant to signal success to onlookers. I took the small, essential things, photographs of places I loved, a few books, my grandmother's locket. The gesture was both symbolic and practical. He would wake in a hollowed-out mansion with exhibition pieces and no meaning. I would wake to the quiet hum of a life I had chosen. People expected me to gloat. They wanted fireworks and Instagram posts dripping with triumph. They expected me to parade his failures like trophies, but I had learned something more valuable than spectacle. The best revenge is a life well lived. It is buying your mornings back, choosing friends for your soul instead of your image, and building days that belong to you rather than to his reflection. A year later, when I walked into a gallery opening where I had been invited as a patron, people who had once whispered about my quiet cluelessness approached me with genuine warmth. They treated me as an equal and intellectual presence, someone who had been tested and emerged refined rather than broken. I remembered how it felt to be on his arm, an accessory to his life, and how hollow that life had been. The new life was quieter in some ways, louder in others, and far more honest. Did David suffer? Yes. His career never recovered the way he imagined. He found new work, smaller, less glamorous roles where he couldn't command rooms. He associated with fewer people who mattered. He smiled less, and when he did, the smile was practical rather than lived. I heard of him sometimes through mutual acquaintances, new cities, new attempts at rebuilding. I did not celebrate his decline. I carried no malice. I simply observed the fairness of consequences, and myself, I rebuilt a life that contained risk and joy in equal measures. I traveled to places I had only once imagined on postcards. I took classes that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with curiosity. I fell in love again, not with a person to anchor me, but with a self that had been dormant for 15 years. When a gentle man named Mark Bright, attentive and content with his own steady life, entered my orbit, I allowed myself to feel it. I did not accept him as a replacement for what I had lost. I accepted him because I had room for something new. On nights when the city lights glow just so, and the memory of that anniversary resurfaces like a bruise, I don't feel the need to return to the past. The sting is dim. It taught me vigilance, but also the power of reinvention. I learned that dignity is constructed, not granted. That a person's worst words cannot define a life unless you let them. When the anniversary rolled around the next year, I did not attend any parties. I brewed coffee, watched the dawn over a skyline that was mine by choice, not by marriage. I sometimes think of David, the man who uttered that sentence in front of friends as though words could turn someone into a caricature. I pity him in small, private ways, because cruelty always reveals weakness. But mostly, I feel the quiet pride of a woman who refused to be consumed by humiliation and instead built something better out of the ashes. If someone asks me now what I would say to him if I saw him on the street, I'd say this simply: thank you. Not for the pain he caused, but for the unexpected gift it gave me clarity. Because without that public blow, I might never have discovered the depths of my own resilience, the scope of my ambition, or the art of choosing dignity. That night, when the memory of his words returns, it no longer pierces, it illuminates. It shows me how far I've come and reminds me that the truest revenge is not cruelty but flourishing,